Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 2nd, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, we're back to talk about a filmmaker who I feel like we just talked about.
He's busy. He's
busy.
Not only does he come out with another film this close to Poor Things, but this movie's almost 3 hours long.
Yeah. He's not even slacking. It's not like he's just making a quite short 90-minute film or something to that extent. No.
Well,
3 more hours of Yorgos Lanthimos. So
apparently he's busy for quite a while, because didn't they announce like 3 upcoming films of his that are coming out pretty soon too?
Yeah. And I think he's working with Jesse Plemons again. I believe he announced. So the man is just
he has his muses.
not stopping.
He has his muses.
He does, indeed. So I'm very excited to dive into this, and I'm equally, doubly excited because we are not in this alone. We have a really great guest, first time on the show, joining us. You can see his great work at InSessionFilm.com. Joining us is Max Vincent. Max, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. I love reading your work. It's fantastic stuff. So it's a pleasure to finally put a face to the written voice, if you will.
It's like the curtain's
cool.
being lifted. The magician's trick is being revealed.
It's fantastic. So first of all, thanks for all your work on the website.
Yeah.
And we're really excited for you to be here. So as we jump into this, tell us, Max, what is your relationship with Yorgos Lanthimos? I know that's a dangerous question these days, but I assume you wanted to talk about this film for a reason. So lay it on us. What do you feel about Yorgos Lanthimos?
Well, I certainly think he's one of the most interesting voices in film right now. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I guess that's up to the audience to decide.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some movies, like I think it was The Killing of the Sacred Deer, I wasn't too crazy about, and The Lobster as well. Like I liked both of them, but it didn't necessarily grab me. And then, of course, The Favorite came out, and that really blew me away. I think that's one of my favorite Lanthimos films. And then, of course, Poor Things was another one that just, knocked my socks off. Emma Stone, just incredible in that film. But I do think, and this may be a controversial opinion because the reactions to this one are all over the place, but I didn't really know what to expect coming into Kinds of Kindness because, the trailer doesn't really reveal that much. It's like 3 seconds or a minute, doesn't really say anything. Reactions of its premiere at Cannes, same thing. And I was blown away by it. And I would even go so far as to say this is his best and funniest piece of work yet.
Ooh, all right. We're jumping right to it. Okay.
Yeah, jumping right to it. All right.
This is going to be interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Brendan and I have an interesting relationship with Lanthimos as well. I feel like generally we've really loved his work. Do you have a preference, Brendan, whether it's his work with Filippo or McNamara?
Oh, I don't have a preference, but I don't. Yeah, but between the 2 writers that he tends to work with, you mentioned Tony McNamara, and I'm always mispronouncing his other writing partner's name here.
Efthimis.
Efthimis Philippou. I believe Philippou is the pronunciation of that last name. And again, if we're mispronouncing that at all, forgive us. We're trying to give credit where credit is due. But yeah, long story short, I don't have a preference between the 2. I think he's made good material between both of those writers because they have very distinct qualities. It's literally 2 phases of Yorgos Lanthimos that I think are interesting. Weirdly, my 2 favorite films of his are probably The Lobster and The Favorite, which represent both ends of that spectrum. Yeah. And I actually didn't love Poor Things as much as others. I did really enjoy it overall, but it's not one of my favorites of his. I'm kind of with you, Max, that The Killing of a Sacred Deer might be lesser Lanthimos as well for me. But I realize if I were to rank his films at this point, they kind of go back and forth between his work with McNamara or Philippou. It's like the odd numbered ones are one, then the even number ones are the other writer. I don't plan it that way, but that tends to be the case for me when it comes to his films. But that's what makes him so interesting. I don't know. Is there really a consensus when it comes to Yorgos Lanthimos as far as
I don't
what
think
his?
so.
But
No,
that's
I
what
don't
makes him
think so.
interesting. Even
Yeah.
the movies of his I don't really like, they're still interesting. They're interesting to talk about, and that's important.
Yeah, I don't really have a preference either. I kind of swing both ways when it comes to Lanthimos.
Mm-hmm.
Although Dogtooth and The Lobster are, I would say, quite easily my favorite two of his, with the
Okay.
favorite there being number 3. But I
Okay.
love his work with McNamara as well. He just has a unique voice, as Max laid out there. He's such a singular filmmaker, and I do love the brazen qualities of his movies. So regardless of the writer that he works with, I think he tends to make great work. I mean, Poor Things, we talked about it a few months ago, obviously, and I love that film. It wasn't quite in my top 10.
Yeah.
And, but even like I look at that film and I go, that's not one of my favorite films of his.
Right.
Like looking at this list, I would maybe have it 5th, and yet that was like number 14 on my list last year. Like
So that
even
means he's
his
doing
quote
something
unquote,
right.
even his quote unquote lesser films are still great. Like he doesn't really have a conventional lesser film in my mind. They're all fantastic. Alps, I think, even that one's not talked about as much, but I still think that's very good as well.
That's a pretty interesting film. I'd take that over Killing of a Sacred Deer, if I'm being honest.
And that's I could see that argument, and I might agree with that depending on the day and what I've most recently seen. I love Killing of a Sacred Deer as well. There are elements of it that, again, might keep it from being my favorite if we're gonna get nitpicky about it. But
Yeah, I think it's really just the ending. I think it reveals
the
too much
ending
by
is a
the
little,
end.
But all that to say, I love his movies. I love him as a filmmaker. I completely and utterly understand why he's not everyone's cup of tea. But on that token, it's why, despite probably having COVID and reeling from that still to this point, I had to try to see that movie. Out of the bajillion things that came out over the weekend, that was the one where I felt like I could make the trip without annoying everyone around me.
I was going to say, the original
it's
plan, you
Lanthimos.
weren't supposed to be here for this one.
Yeah, I
but
was not.
You made the commitment for it.
Yeah, because I love me some Lanthimos, and I was really curious what he would do with Kinds of Kindness just a few months off the heels of Poor Things. So I guess with all of that said, we can jump into the film formally here. This is also a unique film for him in the sense that it's this anthology film.
Yeah.
And it has 3 different segments to it that features essentially the same cast in each vignette, with Emma Stone and Jesse Plemons, Willem Dafoe, Margaret Qualley, Hong Chow, among a few others as well. There's not really a plot synopsis. I mean, it obviously varies from segment to segment. I guess we'll kind of get into it with the bulk of the conversation, what each one is about, I guess. But they're all, it's Lanthimos. They're all kind of fable-y in his own dark, twisted way.
They're dark and twisted. They definitely all feel like they could be Lanthimos films if he were to extend them all out in some type of way. They all deal with similar themes that he and Philippou have dealt with in some of their previous films as well. It's certainly in that wheelhouse.
Okay, so with all of that said, let's go ahead and jump in. We'll start with you, Max. You certainly gave a little bit away there as far as how you feel about this film, but to go into it a little bit further, what did you think about Kinds of Kindness?
Well, there's one important thing I forgot to mention about Lanthimos is that no matter the movies that he makes, he never repeats himself as a filmmaker, stylistically, thematically. Like Poor Things is vastly different from Kinds of Kindness, just from an aesthetic standpoint. You can pinpoint the inspirations in Poor Things, like a Fellini's And the Ship Sails On and other types of movies of that ilk. Whereas Kinds of Kindness, you can't really put your finger on exactly what inspirations, I guess, feed his style and the film itself.
Mm.
And what I found the most fascinating about Kinds of Kindness is that it's obviously a movie about control. All three shorts have a sort of control theme to it.
Yeah.
And we get to see within that control either humans controlling other humans or humans controlling themselves, how they in turn regress. And I found the arcs of the characters, particularly Jesse Plemons, who I think gives the best performance of his career in this film. And there's no there. I can absolutely see why he won Best Actor prize at Cannes. Just absolutely phenomenal work he does here. And I was really enamored by how the movie basically shows us these characters, you know, going through a phase where they just, you know, we meet them at a certain point in time, and by the end of each segment, they've really regressed as human beings because they've been controlled, or you know, they were controlling themselves. And I found that utterly fascinating and surprisingly very funny too. Like I didn't think the movie would be as funny as I thought it was going to be, because I know, you know, Lanthimos uses a lot of dark humor in his movies, but I was laughing for most of the time. Even subtle things that were just happening within the performances of the actors just made me chuckle very hard, because you could easily see how they're playing each character in a deadpan way. And it reminded me a lot of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but the cinema of Quentin Dupieux. He did Rubber, Incredible But True.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. He did these types of movies. I love him. He's one of my favorite filmmakers.
Interesting. Okay.
And he's an acquired taste too.
Yeah.
I understand it. I felt like this movie was very much in line with the type of films that he would make, except except it's much longer.
Yeah, you just revealed something there. The second you said the movie title Rubber, it's like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, I think that's his most known movie internationally, but he had a movie premiered at Cannes this year as well. Oh my god, I forget the title. Anyways, he's a very known filmmaker, and I feel like that it reminded me of that as I was watching the film.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comparison, because when I think about a movie like Rubber, which, full disclosure, I don't care for, it's not quite my cup of tea, but it does carry the same kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of vibe. I feel like this is the most tongue-in-cheek that Yorgos Lanthimos has been among all of his films yet, which is probably where that humor is stemming from. And a lot of those themes you talk about there, Max, whether it be control or even going further, about dominance and submission, the almost fetishistic qualities that he uses to portray those themes. It's just whether he's working with Philippou or McNamara, you tend to find it through more of a lens of, let's say, royalty and the fantastical, or maybe more in the realm of domesticity, something a bit more grounded. He tends to find like those two different layers. So really, Yorgos Lanthimos kind of repeats himself a lot, at least with regard to his themes, but every movie is so aesthetically different that it almost doesn't matter. And that's what makes Kinds of Kindness so interesting. It's probably the most contemporary feeling film of his, certainly the most American feeling film of his thus far, which makes it feel so distant from most of his other films, even something like, let's say, Dogtooth or The Lobster, which are backed by this almost dystopian-like setting. And in a weird way, Kinds of Kindness, it doesn't have that, but it also kind of does. The way that this anthology strings these three narratives together, it almost feels multiversal in a weird way. They're all different, but they're all kind of arguing that they're still part of the same timeline, given maybe one reoccurring character, which we might talk about, that does tie all of these three stories together. So I'm still wrapping my head around this film. I can't say I'm quite there with you yet, Max, as far as me loving it. To be perfectly honest, I was a little... I'm not sure if the anthology-like approach is really what benefits this movie. And maybe that's just what comes with the territory with most anthology films. It's really difficult to get those parts all working at an equal level. I feel like there's a pretty well-regarded consensus out there as to which of the three parts is the best. And I feel like I agree with that consensus. I think the first part is the best one. And I in a weird way, I feel like that should have just been a whole movie in and of itself. But yeah, it's like I think the pieces are there, but I'm not sure if the anthology-like approach allows those ideas to feel as well fleshed out or realized like they were in his previous films. I think that kind of stops it at a slight halt for me, which is why it is lesser Lanthimos for me at this current point. But I was never bored by it. and like I said earlier, movies that are this interesting, even if they don't work for me, I'm glad they exist. I'm glad we get to talk about it. We need movies that challenge the form like that.
Yeah. No one makes movies like Yorgos Lanthimos. There's no doubt about that. Kinds of Kindness is indicative of that as well. I do think there is a lot to like here in terms of the craft and performances as you guys are talking about. I am still wrestling with this. I just saw it a few days ago. As it stands now, I do really like it. I don't know if I love it. Perhaps this conversation will help flesh some things out for me. Lanthimos's Twisted Fables usually work wonders on me. And while I deeply admire that craft you guys are talking about, there are moments here that came off flat for me that I would like to maybe talk about as we go. It is a fascinating study on control, as Max was talking about, the limits of our lives inside those confines and how control can be confused with love. I think is really compelling here. It's complementary to Dogtooth and The Lobster and Killing of the Sacred Deer in that regard, as all of those films feature that element in one way or another. And similarly, there's a dour quality to this film that makes it provocative. The problem for me, given the cruelty and the starkness of his films, if the humor doesn't work and it's emotionally isolating, then it just becomes a bleak exercise in provocation. Something I think he's avoided in his previous films. I love the dark underbelly of Dogtooth and The Lobster and Sacred Deer and The Favorite. There's a weird, terrifying, yet somehow comical bend to those films that I think are woven impeccably. This film doesn't quite strike that same balance. And as a result, while I do admire its playfulness and committed performances, its cynicism comes off maybe a little one-note and exhaustive this time around. I think that's the disparity between myself and where Max lands on this. It doesn't help either that it's thematically muted comparatively to his best work. Now, to be crystal clear on it, the film's thesis on control and its suffocating power in a vacuum especially is engrossing. It is very Lanthimos. I do love what this film is aiming for. And there are these compelling wrinkles thrown in each segment that I do find captivating.
Sure.
However, and I guess this is to your point, Brendan, because each segment is limited, I just don't know if it reaches the depths it wants to explore. There's a cap to it that did frustrate me slightly, which is why the format here simply might be the biggest culprit. I think if each one of these vignettes was extended out to full length, I think I would love them all in various ways.
I weirdly would have
like
loved
them
to
all
see.
in various ways.
Yeah, I think I would have liked to see a trilogy of sorts out of this.
Yeah, I
maybe
would
in
too.
maybe in a similar way to, let's say, the Three Colors trilogy. Some classics like that, where when you have a full feature length movie to flesh out each part, then it allows more room for that nuance that it sounds like you're talking about, JD. Because when you only have 50 minutes or so for each of these parts here, it's where those themes maybe become a little bit more direct. I think this is perhaps the most direct Yorgos Lanthimos film that we've seen thus yet. It's certainly the most on the nose. That's not a bad thing necessarily. I think some movies require a bit more blunt force when it comes to whatever themes or thesis that they're trying to convey. I guess I've always just latched on to like what's the character doing underneath the theme? And maybe this format doesn't allow that kind of room to breathe. But, Max, it worked for you so well. And I want to hear the other side of that coin.
And I typically don't like anthology films also, because you can have a really good short film made by someone, and then what follows from that short film is just not very good. And so usually the experience of watching an anthology film is quite inconsistent.
Yeah.
Even I don't know if you can qualify that as an anthology film, but because Netflix broke it down in several shorts, but then they repackaged it. But the Wes Anderson wonderful story of Henry
Which I
Sugar,
loved. Yeah.
I love those. Yeah, but I'm with you. I would say that regardless of how that was packaged, I see that as an anthology film because all four of them they connect.
They were meant to be connected.
Yeah, they were meant to be connected, but I guess they broke it down because they wanted to win an Oscar.
Stupid algorithm.
But even that movie, like I think it's fine. Like overall, there's some shorts that are stronger than others. But like it's a fairly inconsistent experience for me. But for this one, I found each short to be more engrossing than the last. Like I thought the first short was fantastic. I loved Willem Dafoe, and then the second short was very fascinating because it took a really sharp, radical turn in a way that I just didn't expect because he's suspecting that his wife may not be his wife, and then it just goes into a direction that never in a million years would I think would end this way. And of course, the last one I think is my favorite because it talks about control within the prism of a cult. It's a very literal a definition of control. Emma Stone's character, forget her name, Emily.
I think Emily. That was her name in the third segment. Correct.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she's being controlled by this cult led by Willem Dafoe, but she's also being controlled by her husband, played by Joe Alwyn. And I found that very fascinating how it deals with also resurrecting the dead, that aspect with Hunter Schafer and
the form of ethnic cleansing that's happening there too. And,
it was very fascinating to see how he interweaves real life moments because we back in school we watched a documentary where someone infiltrated Scientology. And it's very, 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 very similar to that experience, especially with the whole sauna thing, cleansing of impurities. And I found that short to be super engrossing. I do wish they were longer though. That would be my main gripe with them. Like I do wish they were longer, giving us a little bit more context of the characters. But still, like it doesn't take long for us to figure out exactly what's going on and then kind of go along with it. Even if we're not necessarily into it that much, we can still be in it. Like, we can still be invested in it to the very end because we want to figure out exactly what's going on. And I found it really fascinating and very funny too. Like a lot of people talk about how stilted, unnatural, even the acting is, but that's why I want to sort of compare it to Dupuis' work because in his movies, the acting is always stilted, unnatural, weird. And it always gives this sort of off-kilter vibe, and sometimes it works very well, sometimes it doesn't. But in the case of Kinds of Kindness, even Jesse Plemons when he's pretending to have an injury in the first short,
I have thoughts on that. I have thoughts on that. Yeah,
that was very funny, and I always love it when actors they're aware that they're acting and they're purposefully making it bad, so that we're adding another layer of comedy to it.
Yeah. I don't think the performances here are really my problem with the movie as to why it's not working as well for me as maybe for you, Max. I think if anything, it's first off, I love what you're saying about how that third segment has sort of its own maybe real life ramifications of what it's taking inspiration from, which I think that might be my second favorite of the three because it actually has some form of secret relatability. But that's also why I feel like the first one was my favorite because it's the one that felt the most complete to me. I feel like that one in its own vacuum, if you will, actually has the most to offer. And I feel like that one maybe has its own more emotional nucleus because Jesse Plemons is so front and center, and his predicament in that first one has maybe the most relatability that I think most people who are going to see this film can actually latch on to. Just the simple idea of being governed by some parental figure of sorts to the point that the character that he plays, Robert, is not even able to make decisions for himself. He's basically a man-child. That whole first segment is the story of a man-child and how he needs that control in his life. And there's a weird, quirky tragedy to that one. And I think that one felt the most complete on its own. So it also makes me wonder, sometimes a good anthology film works depending on how they're ordered. And in your case, Max, it seems like you like them more as they progressed. So your ranking is 3, 2, 1. I wonder if I would
for this one, yes, but it depends on
Yeah, but it obviously depends. But I feel like in most cases, if that's your reaction to an anthology film, you're probably going to like the full product more because it ends on that high note for you. And I do wonder if I maybe had a reverse opinion on how I feel about each of these three individually, would that have changed my overall thoughts on the film as a whole in totality?
Mm.
And maybe it would have. I think that's an overarching question for all anthology films, if that's even something worth like wrestling with.
Mm. Yeah, I think what's interesting, and perhaps I fall in the middle of you guys in the sense that I don't really have a favorite. I really like all three of them equally. I do think there
Okay.
is a thematic consistency to them that progresses in this fascinating way. Really, my biggest hurdle here is a byproduct of the prowess of Lanthimos, which
Okay.
is somewhat of a funny thing to say, that he's so good at what he does that it simply has me salivating for more. That what we get here, while it's good, it feels like there's half a movie waiting to be made still. Like I was
It's
really
like the
gripped
reputation
by,
of Lanthimos hurts this movie.
yeah, like I was really gripped by what he was doing, that when it only feels half realized, it leaves you wanting for more, which is a good thing, but also there is a level of dissatisfaction that I do think there's
Well,
more
yeah.
to be mined here. And that to me is the biggest issue, or my biggest dissenting sentiment here when you compare it to something like, and I honestly didn't even think about it, but I'm glad that you did, Max, when we talk about Wes Anderson and the Doll Shorts, which I think is maybe the best thing Wes Anderson's ever done. I think it is fantastic. It is really, really great.
I
And
wouldn't go that far,
all
but I
of
do really
those,
like it.
I would absolutely go that far.
I know,
It's
yeah,
top
yeah.
three for me. Top three.
I think it's really good. I think they're all
Yeah.
really good though.
And they're all complementary to each other. They're all fully realized, and there's this thematic progression to them that, as we talked about on the show, is absolutely engrossing. And I do think that this film is functioning in a similar-ish kind of way. It just feels like there comes a point where it is just stilted, or it just kind of like the momentum stops. And it's not that it's such a weird thing to experience, at least from my perspective, that it was so good that when it just stops, it's like, okay, well, where's the rest of this? And so it's a weird criticism in that regard. And maybe the other thing for me, it does come back to the tone of it. I just didn't find this as funny as I've loved his other works. And
That's fair.
that to
That's
me
fair.
is really the biggest disparity here. As much as I can sit here and go, well, maybe these shouldn't, the format could be a problem here, and maybe it is. But more than that, it's the idea of like the humor just doesn't land for me. And as a result, that's where it becomes a little exhaustive with this cynicism. But I do think, thematically speaking, there's some really fascinating things here that I really love, which is why I don't really have a preference as far as which one I like the most. I think there's an interesting progression, and I don't know if you guys share the same interpretation, Brennan, based off of what you're saying. It sounds like yours was slightly off than how I read it, but
Okay.
the way that I looked at all three of these as it relates to Control are these different factions of life. And the first one, I saw this more as corporate America, like a fable on corporate structures and control, and how they have a grip on your life every minute of the day. And, to the point where if you want to succeed in corporate America, you have to go to these extremes. And there are revelations in that first one that I think are pretty devastating.
Sure.
And then you get to the second one, which is about marriage control. And I found that one extremely affecting when you think about Daniel and how he expects his wife to behave a certain way. And when she gets out of line, then all of a sudden I'm questioning everything. Like, she has to prove her loyalty and love at every moment. And again, it involves extremes. And I think the symbolism
yeah.
there is quite fascinating. And then you get to the last one, which is about religion. That's how I interpreted it, about religious
Very much about
control.
religious fanaticism and
The
those
moment
classic
that
things we've talked
you're
about.
not pure anymore, we do not want you.
Yeah.
You are not a part of our group. And when you couple that with so much of what we see today in the news, I think that is also extremely, extremely relatable and palpable and effective. So to me, it's not that these segments in a vacuum aren't effective. They are. They're extremely effective, I think. But to the point where it felt like they were just half stories, though, because it's Lanthimos. He's not doing anything half-ass here. Everything is full bore. And because of that, it just feels like there's half a story missing. And which is, again, it's a weird criticism to have about a movie, about a storyteller, but to me, it just speaks to the prowess of him as a storyteller and filmmaker, that an anthology format, I just don't know if it services his style of storytelling, because he's just too thorough.
Well, I will say I don't really disagree at all with what you're saying as far as your thematic interpretation of the entirety of Kinds of Kindness and how each of these three segments have their own lens around control. If I call that first segment the most relatable, it's maybe it really comes down to the innocence in Jesse Plemons' performance in that one. I think that's where maybe that one is the most relatable. And I do agree with you, Max. I think Jesse Plemons might be the standout as far as a performance to pick out here. Who among them is probably doing the best work? I think it's no question it's Jesse Plemons. If someone wants to say it's the best performance of his career, I don't necessarily have much to push back on. I think he's given great performances in many other films as well, but he's doing a lot of interesting things here for sure. I think the other thing too, and maybe this backs up a little bit with what you're saying, JD, another reason why I felt I responded the most to that first segment is that it's the one of the three that felt the most like it had perhaps the clearest first, second, and third act. I feel like that one actually had more of that sense of momentum you get in a more, I guess, traditional movie-like structure. The second and third segments here, it almost feels like we get a clearly defined third act, and then it just rushes to an explosive climax. I feel like they're almost paced in a way like that, which is maybe why they felt a little bit more incomplete to me, as opposed to that first one, which I think had a bit more of a smoothness to it. And that smoothness I didn't quite sense in the other two, which is why maybe just overall to your point, JD, I think the anthology-like format may not have been best suited for Yorgos here. I like I said, I would have loved to see this as a trilogy. I think there are interesting things here in all three to have explored further. And who knows? Maybe in like 3 years we'll find out this was just a trial run for said trilogy. And maybe this is like the director's cut of Napoleon all over again. We're gonna get like a 7-hour version of this, which
I would see it.
I weirdly wouldn't be opposed to that if I'm being honest.
Yeah, Max, anything to add to that?
Well, I had a thought and I just blanked. It'll come back to me like literally in a second.
No, I'll go. I can certainly go off of that as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that's, really the only thing that keeps me from fully embracing this film and what I think it is, because I do really like it. I just think that there are moments that keep it from being great, but the wrinkles that he throws in, as far as at least my fundamental interpretation of it, it is interesting to see those Lanthimos turns that he throws in here. For example, going back to that first one, the death of RMF, there's a moment where Jesse Plemons as Robert, he tells his wife why they can't have children. He reveals the truth as to what's been happening. And while I do think that it all circles back to, again, that corporate control and the lengths that people will go to in order to succeed in that world, and there's further extremes even as it goes. It gets quite crazy. But that's the moment that felt so Lanthimos to me, because inside of his dark, twisted fables, the relationships and the sharpness he brings to the dynamic of his characters is what I find most striking about his films. And that's that moment, at least in that first one, where you really feel the sting of that moment. And of course, we never see her again, which I thought was an interesting little touch to
very
that whole
ghostly.
sequence.
Yeah, I kept waiting
Yeah.
for that character to come back, and then never does.
It
And like,
just
they're actually
lingers.
like the lack of an emotional payoff there is actually what gives that first part an emotional payoff to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So as much as this is about control, and I do think it's funneled through a corporate lens, a marriage lens, and then a religious lens. I mean, relationships and maybe even marriage broadly is such a big part of it. You see that element in all three segments in one way or another, pretty prominently, obviously, in the second one, RMF is flying, but it's a part of that first one. It's a part of the third one as well. I believe earlier, Brendan, you talked about how sex as control is a big factor in all three of these as well. And there's wrinkles to that. I will say I did not laugh with this movie all that much. And that was one of the biggest hurdles for me. However, there was one moment, and I believe I mentioned this on the main show, because of my sickness, and I have this nasty cough at the moment. I went to the theater. I took this sweatshirt with me, and I used it primarily as like a muffled if I had to cough.
Yeah, you were a dog with a muzzle.
Project. It was like a little muzzle. However, I also had to use it for this one moment where it provoked simultaneous laughter and coughing at the same time. And again, there's like 10 of us in the theater, so if I just bust out laughing, I mean, it's
going to lead to a coughing fit.
It's going to be bad. But that moment where Daniel's like, I want to watch the video, and we have no idea what this video is. But this is a guy that is supposedly grieving. And when it cuts to what the video actually is, I nearly fell out of my seat. I did not anticipate that at all. And maybe I should have, because it's Lanthimos. But
it's like it's so casual. It's treated so casually.
It's treated so casually.
So hilarious.
It's so funny. But it also speaks to what this film is in terms of sex as control, marriage and relationships, that whole dynamic. So it's a funny gag, but it also works thematically extremely well for this film and these three vignettes. And it was fantastic.
Yeah, so I wrote it down to make sure I didn't forget. I was going to say that it's very interesting to see this movie after the very crowd-pleasing success of Poor Things, and the contrast between Lanthimos working with Tony McNamara. Even if it's a little odd here and there, generally it's a film that was very appreciated by the masses. I mean, it won the most Oscars after Oppenheimer, and then goes back to work with a famous Philippou and delivers this, bold swing that is all over the place, and it's garnering a lot of very interesting discussions. Like even the more very negative reviews are interesting to read as much as the positive, very glowing reviews of this film. I think what I found really funny, the video was was very funny. I also wasn't really expecting that, but I also think, again, the subtle shifts in the characters were also funny to me. I especially love Jesse Plemons in the first short because, as it was mentioned, he is someone who loves to be controlled. Actually, he has this dream. He's in the parking lot. He's pleading to come back to his company. He'll do anything he wants, and then that happens in real life.
It's like the childlike nature of him in that one, I think, is really quite. That's what I like about that short so much. And there are things about that one that made me laugh a lot, especially his his quote unquote fake injury, as you alluded
Yeah,
to
when he
earlier,
goes to the hospital and then he dresses himself as
Well,
one of the
even
one of the
before that,
nurses.
even before that, when he tries to recreate the moment where he met his wife because of his injured hand,
Yeah.
and when he tries to actually fake it for another girl, and just I feel like that shot has been kind of memeified right now. I think there's a GIF of it already on Twitter if you post it somewhere, of just him screaming into the camera, his fake It's one of the funniest things in the movie for me. Thinking of other moments here that really made me laugh, the moment that made me laugh the hardest, I don't know if it was even intentional or not, but it actually goes to that second part once again. There's a character by the name of, I think, Dr. Evans in that second part. He's played by an actor named Nathan Mulligan, who, if you look at Nathan Mulligan's filmography, his only work is maybe working as a painter for movies like Antebellum, or the additional crew of Geostorm, or the additional crew of Terminator Genesis. This individual is not really an actor, and I think he gives one of the worst performances I've ever seen in a movie. Like it is,
Oh, wow.
it is so bad and so distracting. I laughed so hard at that, and I don't know if I was supposed to. I couldn't tell if that was just the filmmakers, Yorgos and team, realizing, okay, we need someone to rapidly fill the shoes for this character because it's in the script, or if they were intentionally having a bad performance conveyed out of Dr. Evans here. I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed that, but I was so enamored by that. It was so jarring to the point that I kind of have to give the film credit for how bad that is. But I don't know. It's just something I noticed.
Couldn't tell you. I would have to revisit the film and look for that specifically.
I will stand by that. I think it is one of the worst performances I've ever. I think it's Tommy Wiseau bad. It was that distracting for me.
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't know. I cannot speak to it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Max.
Well, if you didn't notice it, then I must be the only one.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I also saw 3 3-hour movies on that week, so it's still like I'm thinking
so his
about
mind
Yeah,
is
so a little
buzzing.
known nobody named Nathan Mulligan is probably not going to stand out to you as much as a Jesse Plemons or an Emma Stone would. That's totally
Yeah.
understandable. But yeah, I couldn't help but notice that. I was so.
Oh, you see the
I
guy
was
that
so
plays the doctor who evaluates
the
Jesse
psychological
Plemons?
doctor.
Yeah.
It is such a bad performance. But I feel like it must be deliberately bad. It is.
Yeah. I think it was.
It's oh my gosh. JD, watch the movie again. Come back to me and see
Okay.
what your thoughts are. I'm genuinely curious if you have a similar reaction to me on that one.
Yeah, I did not notice it as much. I don't know. Maybe it was a mindset thing. I don't know. Maybe I was concentrating too hard on not disturbing everyone around me that much of the humor missed me on that first go around. I mean, I'd be willing to give it a go simply because I love these performances. I love the craft here. And I think thematically, even though at the end of it, there was a level of dissatisfaction because I felt like there was so much more to be mined out of this because what is there is really great. I'd still be willing to give it a go just for that alone. And maybe the humor will come back to me because I just didn't really sense much of it here as I did with something like The Lobster, for example, which I do think is very funny in a Lanthimos twisted kind of way. But like his humor generally has always worked for me. Even with his films with Filippo. I mean, Dogtooth is a weird, dark movie, but there's funny elements to that as well that I've always really enjoyed about his films. For some reason, it just doesn't register with me here as deeply. But I'm also willing to admit that could be me. That just could have been my mindset and watching it in the state that I am at the moment. Maybe that's all it is. I mean, I don't know, but I certainly didn't feel it as much, especially as it went. Like I do like the first one, the death of RMF. I think it's much more prominent there. I really did not sense it much in the second and third ones as much as you feel kind of the dark ironies at play, especially when you start talking about the sex, control and manipulation of the third one, which at times gets quite dark. Now but the first one, and it's not just Plemons' performance. Some of it is the staging and how Lanthimos frames certain moments. Because I also think of that moment when Robert walks into Rita's house and he sees the broken racket there. Like that is
Yeah.
a moment of editing and framing doing much of the heavy lifting there in terms of the humor. But just to see Robert see it and then grab it and walk out as if it's something that he owns, I did admittedly chuckle at that. I thought
Yeah,
that
there's
was a
an
little humorous.
awkwardness to it. That's
Yes,
the thing that
yeah,
Yorgos is really good at. He's really good at finding humor in the awkward.
yeah.
And maybe that's where it might feel a little stilted, to your point earlier, Max, that some people may react to each performance here as somewhat tame or stilted by comparison. But that's only if you're not willing to look past that and find the awkwardness there. I think these are very awkward performances in very awkward situations. And that's going to test the tastes of many people. But I find that awkwardness really amusing, which is why I normally gravitate towards Yorgos. I think he's really good at
Same.
handling that.
Yeah, normally I do as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I just didn't feel it here, especially with the second and third vignettes.
I want to watch
but-
this one again. I'll simply say that.
Yeah. But in terms of the ideas that it's toying with, like I especially, and maybe it simply comes down to personal experiences and how you feel about certain things. But the third vignette, RMF eats a sandwich, which admittedly a humorous title,
Yeah.
but what we see visually, not quite as humorous for me. But that whole idea of religious control is something that I do find extremely poignant. And I do think that is really effective. And maybe that's why I didn't find much humor in it, because I think the realities that he's depicting there, albeit through this incredible symbolism, is incredibly palpable and something that has these massive ramifications in the real world. And I like the way he depicts that, to me, just has this gravitas to it that I think is really great. So it's hard for me to see the humor there, especially when you look at some of the things that happens to Emily in that sequence, and you talk about control and how she loses control on several fronts in that whole sequence. And it's just this, I don't know how that one might be the longest one of them. I'm not sure how long it is, 45 minutes, 50 minutes
think they're all 50
of
minutes.
mostly just pure devastation. And I found it heartbreaking. So like it's, to me, it was really effective in that regard. But in a lot of ways, I also feel the same way about how he depicts control in marriage in that second one. And the whole idea of Daniel and expecting Liz to react and behave a certain way, and how that devolves as the film goes, or how as the segment goes, I think is, again, it's extremely haunting.
It's almost like this whole idea that, oh, she's not really my wife. She's actually replaced by someone else who looks like my wife. It sort of raises this question: does he truly believe that, or is that just his excuse to get what he wants? And I do think the film raises that question, doesn't really answer, which I think is fascinating at the very least.
I agree. And again, it ends in this bleak moment of devastation. And I think that final shot is this horrifying facade.
Oh, I don't think it's real at all. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's absolutely not. And again, speaking to the extremism of love and control, the confusion there, and the way he dangles the string. Speaking of Daniel, the Plemons character in that second segment, I mean, it is truly horrifying. Like it is
Creepy.
one of the most
it's serial killer level
evil
creepy.
and antagonistic characters I've seen all year. And Plemons is great, like really great at depicting kind of this initial confusion in the character, and you do empathize with him a little bit, but when you start to feel your way through the fable, and you see what Lanthimos is really doing there, and it's this incredibly calculated and doleful depiction of prove your loyalty to me, prove your love to me, and the moment that you don't live up to my expectations, the ramifications are
Yeah.
dark.
Just because your shoes no longer fit.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like,
Yeah.
like I do love that. Like those two vignettes. I wanted full movies of those. Full movies. I would see full movies of all three of them. Really.
Maybe we'll get them.
Maybe we
let's
will.
let's write a letter to Yorgos himself and see if he's willing to do more work for just the In Session Film podcast.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any final thoughts you guys have on Kinds of Kindness?
I think you guys bring up very interesting points on your interpretations of the film. I do think what's very fascinating about this movie, and like any Lanthimos movie, is that he leaves it open for all of us to sort of discern, what we see based on our experiences,
Sure,
and based on
yeah.
also what we know about the human condition and what we know about control as well. So we all have different experiences. As someone who loves absurd comedies, stilted, deadpan acting,
Yeah.
very awkward situations, almost, I mean, not necessarily, but borders sometimes on cringe comedy. I thought this film was a laugh riot. I was laughing for most of the time. Even the sequences were pretty serious. I think the way the actors would portray them was very funny to me. But two of my favorite movies this year are Quentin Dupieux's Yannick and Dali, and these are both films. They're not out in the U.S. yet, but they're both films that are just thriving on making the audience feel as uncomfortable as possible, playing with time, and also being as awkward as possible, even going so far as to repeat the same scene over and over and over again. And there are moments in Kinds of Kindness where I think it was Willem Dafoe's character makes Jesse Plemons, stand up, go back to the entrance, and then come back and sit down. And then, oh no, I like it better when you were standing up. So stuff like that. For me, some people.
That worked for me. Yeah, I'm with you. That worked for me.
For me, I think I thrive on comedy like this because it's very awkward and it's very, if done right and if timed well, it's fantastic. And that's why I think stuff like this just and aesthetically too. I don't think we've talked about the aesthetic of the movie that much, but what a difference is it from Poor Things to this, and how it just creates this massive, like, it's weird, like it almost has a very sort of epic cinematic look and feel, even if the contents of the movie don't really lend itself to that. Like the aesthetic is disassociated from the stories that we observe in the score. Also, piano heavy score from Jerskin Fendrix also adds that sort of discombobulating.
It's basically just making up notes. It's making up chords.
Yeah, it's like fooling around with the piano, and then
it's a score by a 4-year-old, basically.
Yeah, but the use of choirs too. Also,
they do.
In the third short, really elevates that sense of tension and awkwardness. And I don't think Emma Stone delivers a better performance than Bella Baxter in Poor Things, but for me it came pretty close. And Jesse Plemons as well. I could wax lyrical about him, all podcast long, just a Jesse Plemons show, because I think he's just amazing in this movie. He's always impressed me, but he really takes it to another level here. Especially, and I also really like that about all the other actors as well. They play vastly different characters from segment to segment. Like they're not the same. They're even just the way they dress, the way they speak, even their physicality. Like in the first short, Jesse Plemons, he's got this. He's almost has this sort of porn stash, and then in the second segment, he's got a buzz cut. He's got glasses. That's in the third one, but he's just fantastic, and he's got different physicalities, different ways of approaching characters, and it's a very fascinating movie. It's one that I will remember for a very long time, and I eagerly await Lanthimos's latest movie, which will also star Emma Stone and Jesse Plemons.
Like we said, he's got his muses. He's got his muses.
Yeah.
I do appreciate how aesthetically different this one is from Poor Things, especially when you consider that they were all still shot by Robbie Ryan. And here's a film that I don't even recall ever utilizing the fisheye lens that was all over movies like The Favorite, for instance. So
Mhm.
I like it when artists are able to develop their own noticeable cinematic language, but they never repeat themselves. They always try new things to the point that
It
if you
is
didn't know
utilized once, though. There is
it
one
is,
moment.
but you blink and you kind of miss it, right?
Oh, I didn't miss it. I didn't
I
blink and miss it.
but I think if you do blink, you could miss it.
Yeah, it is very different. To your
it,
point,
it,
it is
it is very
ultimately a very
different.
different
Yeah,
movie. Yeah.
there's more of a cryptic nature to it, I feel like, and I think that makes the movie fascinating. I also like that despite how different all these performances are, when you compare all three characters that each performance is portraying, I still kept weirdly noticing what could be seen as maybe parallels between them as well. And I don't know if that was intentional. That's why I said maybe this almost has like this strange multiversal quality to it. And then when you look at all the titles here that reference a single character by the name of RMF, and
Yeah.
the way the film concludes maybe emphasizes this possible circular nature happening here. And this character is played by a single actor. His name is, and hopefully I'm going to pronounce his name right, uh, Yorgos Stephanakos. And I don't really think I don't think he really has much work. I know he was in Poor Things. I think that's really it. I think it's only this and Poor Things are the only two movies that this individual has appeared in. But he is the through line between all three of them. And it did make me think if there were also deliberate parallels as well as contradictions between them all, which again, it makes this movie a really fascinating one to talk about. When I
Mhm.
find myself on the lower end of the spectrum with Yorgos, I'm still glad that movie exists as it does.
Mhm.
Because I don't want to love all of his films. I want to find myself discombobulated by some of his and challenged in a way that I even find myself wrestling with. And I like when that happens. So even at this point, I would probably rank this one towards the this is probably bottom two for me in Yorgos's filmography. And full disclosure, I haven't seen what's it, Canetta? I think that's his first film. I haven't seen that one yet. So I can't speak to that. But it's between this and Sacred Deer that I don't quite love, but it's still doing things that I appreciate. And I
Mhm.
weirdly like that I don't like them, which is a weird thing to say. I like when a filmmaker can do that. I like when they challenge the form like that.
Yeah, I mean, I do still really like this, even if we've seen Lanthimos tackle films about control in some way, shape, or form. We've never really seen him do it this directly and brazenly before,
Mhm.
and I very much did respond to its symbolic fortitude. I think
Mhm.
it is really great in that regard. I just wish there was more of it. It does feel a little stilted to me, and its cynicism, again, I did find a little exhaustive this time around. But that might change on a rewatch, maybe when I'm in a different mental state
Yeah.
and
No muzzle.
I can respond to the humor a little bit more. I'm certainly willing to, maybe give pause on that reservation. But on this first viewing, I didn't really respond to the humor like I normally do with Lanthimos, and
Mhm.
I typically love his style of comedy, and it's so crucial to his films. Otherwise, I do think they are overwhelming if that humor doesn't work. But it's always worked for
Yeah.
me. He's always been able to strike that balance. But for whatever reason, and it could be the format as well, I just think that it doesn't always come together for me here. But when it does, it deeply registers with me. And I do love how he explores sex here, how he explores relationships, and how he funnels it through marriage and religiosity and all that stuff that we talked about. I will echo you guys on Jesse Plemons. He is terrific in this film. And
It's
all
great.
three of them, he's really great. It's one of the best performances of the year. I will agree with you guys about the film aesthetically. I think it is fascinating. The contemporary lens that he gives to this film is
Mhm.
such a stark contrast coming off the heels of Poor Things, as we noted earlier. But I do really like that about this experience as well. And the other thing as well that we haven't really talked about here, I really liked Jerskin Fendrick's score for this as well. It's very Lanthimos, as
Sure.
it
Yeah.
typically is, but there's something about those kind of dark melancholic, mysterious tones that he brings to the score here that I think is extremely effective. The soundtrack on the whole is really great as well. The bookends of the soundtrack, to be maybe more precise, extremely vibrant, but really fun.
Sure.
And get you in and out of the movie in a great way. But Fendrick's score in between is really quite great. So, yeah, I mean, there's still a lot to really like here, as I noted up front. It doesn't all come together for me, but I still really appreciate it. As far as our ranking goes, this is probably near the bottom for me. But again, I love all of these to some degree or another. So, like, I just don't think he has a bad film here. So putting this near the bottom, I mean, what is that? I don't know if that tells us anything other than I really like his movies.
Other than he makes weird shit. That's
stuff.
that's the only way you can say it.
And I love it. And I'm totally here for it. And I look forward to what he has next. So at any rate, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, please reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us incessionfilm@gmail.com. As we wind down here, Max, thanks so much for being here, man. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It was great.
Yeah,
absolutely. Tell us about the stuff that you're working on, the writing. Where can we find you? Where can we find you on social media?
Yes, well, on social media, you can find me at Max from Quebec on all social media, the same handle everywhere. As far as the things that I'm working on, well, today I just finished school, so that's
education's important.
Yeah, so that's a milestone done. I just submitted my final paper. It took me a long time.
Oh,
that's
nice! Congrats, man.
Yeah, congrats. That's very cool.
And as far as my my film writing endeavors happen, I've got 2 reviews that I've published on IncessionFilm.com. Actually, I think yesterday, for Kalki 289880.
Oh, yeah.
And Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1, 2 very long movies.
Yeah.
I'm going to say one's an Indian film, one's a Kevin Costner film. So, yes, you're going to be in the theater for a while.
If you guys thought, Kinds of Kindness was too long, well, here are 2 more very long movies that I also saw about at the same time frame.
Yeah.
Very interesting movies to talk about, whether I like them or not. I like one more than the other.
Okay.
You can check those reviews out on IncessionFilm.com.
Yeah, the Kalki review has been one of our most read reviews all year.
It's just been published for like a day, I think.
Yeah.
There's an audience for that material. Well. There really is.
Absolutely. Yeah. So people are loving your work, Max. Keep up the great work. We do love that. But yeah, really appreciate all your work there. Appreciate you being here on the show. Be sure to give Max a follow on social media as well. And of course, check out his great work at IncessionFilm.com. With that, just a quick reminder that the main show, episode 592, is available. It is up right now. Brendan and I talk about our top 5 movies of the year so far. So you can go and check that out. It was a ton of fun. And there will be a review for Quiet Place Day 1 coming soon as well. So with all of that said, do you guys have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
Be kind. Be kind.
Be kind?
Be a kind of kindness to each other.
Yeah. Kind of kindness. Be Yorgos Lanthimos.
I'm sure he's a kind fella.
Really. Yeah. At any rate, with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.